With thousands of alien abduction accounts being reported throughout the world every year, many are left wondering what the agenda of these abductors may be. Some say they are harvesting and genetically engineering a new alien-human hybrid species. If so, are they seeding many worlds with these new hybrid species, and are they inserting alien-human hybrids into our world? Also, why do the abductors only pick a select few as their victims, and what are the common characteristics of these people? Author and former Wright-Patterson Air Force Base engineer Raymond Szymanski joins me to talk about his latest book in his 50 Shades of Grey series, Victoria's Secret Truth, which documents a very fascinating abduction case. After undergoing several hypnotic regressions, Victoria has recalled many abduction accounts throughout her lifetime. Why do people like Victoria become the target of so many abductions, and what can we learn about her and many others' accounts? Join Raymond and I on this episode as we explore many of these questions and more. Well, greetings out there, everyone, and welcome. I'm Curry Stegan, host of Passion for the Paranormal, and I'm bringing my passion for the paranormal to you. It's wonderful to be back with you again. I've got a great episode in store for you. My guest is none other than Raymond Szymanski, and Raymond's going to be talking to me about his latest book in his book series, 50 Shades of Grey's Victoria's Secret Truth. So it's really great to have Raymond joining me on the show. If you haven't been over to the website, please head over to passion4theparanormal.com, and you can blog about past episodes there. You can catch up with some of the past episodes, and you can check out some cool books from past guests we've had on the show. And make sure you also visit us on Facebook at facebook.com/passion4theparanormal. And we're also on Twitter at twitter.com/passion4thepara. That's P-A-R-A. So make sure you visit us there as well. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get into the interview with Raymond. And I really, really think you're going to enjoy tonight's episode. And thank you so much for tuning in. All right, so my guest tonight is Raymond Szymanski, and Raymond is a former Wright-Patterson Air Force Base engineer, and Raymond is a paranormal and UFO researcher and now has 2 books to his name, and the first book is 50 Shades of Grey's Evidence of Extraterrestrial Visitation to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and Beyond. And his latest book, which just came out a couple of months ago, is the next book in the series, 50 Shades of Grey's Victoria's Secret Truth. Raymond, thank you so much for joining me on the show tonight.
Awesome. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, it's great to have you joining me on the show. I did get a chance to go through the second book here, which we're going to talk about. And fascinating stuff. Really, really interesting book. And but before we get into that discussion, can you kind of take us back to, how you got involved in this UFO phenomena, researching it and writing about it?
Yeah, it was kind of by accident. I had a mentor back in 1973 when I reported to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base as a cooperative education student out of the University of Detroit. And I'm sure they're all cringing there, the alumni, as they're hearing me talk about how I've spent my fine education. so it was the first week of my. I said, hey, I'm going to take you to the other side of the complex here, and I'll show you where the greasy spoon is at. So he wanted to show me where the coffee shop was at, and to show you, give it a mental image of the configuration, it was a 2-story office building, and then a 250-foot hangar connected to a twin 2-story office building. So we had to walk from one office building through this dark, empty, deserted hangar at the time to get to the coffee shop. And on our way, we just stepped into the other building. It was empty. It had nothing but spider webs at the time. And he turns to me and says, "Have you heard about an aliens?" So I was a little mystified, and I said, "Aliens?" And he went on to explain about a crash out west and how the aliens and their machines were brought to Wright-Patterson for evaluation and possible exploitation. So we had a several-minute conversation about that as, we bought the candy bar and walked back through the hangar. And he said things like, well, they're kept in a tunnel. My response was, we have tunnels? I mean, this is my first week. I knew nothing about Wright-Patterson, but apparently, because of Project Blue Book that had been on the base for 22 years, along with its predecessor projects, Sign and Grudge, which were investigations into the UFO phenomena by the Air Force, that everybody was pretty much well schooled in the fact that Wright-Patterson and UFO investigations were actually connected. And my mentor, Al, was basically reading me in on all of that and letting me know that, hey, we got something special here, and we think you'll know about it. So that's where it all started.
Yeah, interesting, because I think we talked a little bit before, and I told you, I'm a retired Air Force Reserve officer, and it's really not a subject. I've always had interest in the subject for so many years, but it's really not a subject I really broached much with my colleagues. And I'm just wondering, you had the one gentleman that brought it up. Did you have a lot of other colleagues that weren't even open to that discussion that you worked with, whether they're other engineers or just other government employees you worked with there at Wright-Patterson?
Well, the short answer is yes. And the long answer is, we used to have the 8.5 by 11, just a standard sheet of paper, and Xeroxed on this paper is what was titled the U.S. Air Force UFO Identification Chart. And it was tongue-in-cheek humor, and on this chart were 16, maybe a dozen more, different objects, like, let's say the Klingon battleship, or the USS Enterprise, and a weather balloon, and a classic sausage craft, and all sorts of missiles and things that you would find in the air at one time or another, in fiction or in real life. And under each of these objects, the Air Force had identified them as a weather balloon. But the weather balloon object on that chart was identified as swamp gas, obviously an ode to J. Allen Hynek's very famous Michigan investigation. And so people who had that little UFO identification chart posted in their cubicle, it was a sign. And it basically said, hey, I'm cool about the subject, and if you want to talk to me about it, I'm willing to do so. So anytime you saw that posted in somebody's cubicle, you knew you could talk to them about it. And to the people who didn't know, they just thought, you were making fun of your employers. But for the rest of us, we knew that it was the secret and that, hey, I'm hip to all this, and hey, let's have a chat. So yeah, I've talked to a lot of people about it.
Wow, that's that's interesting that you kind of have that code going that lets you kind of be in the safe zone on that topic. I wanted to get into, because really I wanted to talk about the new book, and can you kind of take us back to how you got involved in researching and writing about this story for Victoria and about her abduction accounts?
Absolutely. The first time I went to the International UFO Congress, I think it was maybe 2013, and back in about 2012, 2013, I went to my first International UFO Congress, and I had just heard the first talk. It was the very first time I'd ever gone to a UFO Congress. And into the row, I sat on the aisle seat. To the row comes a gentleman by the name of Glenn. I didn't know his name before. And a lovely woman by the name of Victoria. And so we heard the next speaker. And at the intermission, the guy turns to his girlfriend at the time and says, "Can I tell him?" She says, "Of course." So he turns to me and says, "My girlfriend here has several children on a spaceship." Well, could have knocked me over with a phaser beam. Imagine, I've just heard my first talk. I'm at the break, and the guy tells me that this lovely woman sitting next to him has got several children on a spaceship. And she kind of leans over and nods, like in approval to whatever her boyfriend was saying. So I had a chance to talk with them throughout the duration of the conference and really didn't give it much thought. Then I think this was about 2016. I was back at the conference. not so much as a consumer of information, but I had just published my first book, and the lovely Yvonne Smith, who's world famous for being a hypnotic hypnotherapist, or whatever her license actually declares her to be, but she's regressed thousands of people who believe they've had contact. And we were sharing a table, and I was autographing books and kind of really basking in the attention and the conversation. And when that was all over, I was totally exhausted. So I went to the casino next with $20 in my hand because the conference was over. I was leaving the next day, and I just wanted to play some slots and have a beer. But its inner voice in me said, go back, just take a walk through this casino. And I found myself walking to the very back of it, a place I shouldn't have been because it was full of smoke and I'm semi-allergic to it. And there's Victoria playing some blackjack. And the next thing you know, we're engaged in a conversation about things we talked about 3 or 4 years earlier, about this statement her boyfriend made to me. And slowly but surely she said, well, I'm not really sure what it's all about, but I've had all these random stories that, share with you. And at that point, I thought, well, wow, this is really intriguing. So it was just by happenstance that both of us had decided to stay that evening at the conference. My inner voice guided me to a place where I shouldn't have been because I didn't like the casino anyway, because it was a smoker's casino and it really wasn't comfortable for me. But that's how it all started, me just being guided by some force that I can't quite explain.
Interesting. Yeah, and early on in the book you talk about some of her early accounts. And what I found interesting is you kind of weave in a discussion about UFOs and their interest in, any of our nuclear sites or our missile sites. And it's interesting because she seemed to just happen to live close to a nuclear plant. And I think in the book you talk about her mom had suffered some from working in the plant, had suffered some ailments. But can you talk a little bit about the connection there and how you think this might be related to her abductions?
Okay. Well, Victoria's mother worked at National Lead of Ohio, and she had a severe case of rheumatoid arthritis. And if you get the book, Victoria's Secret Truth, there's a section in there that I devote to her mother and the ailment. And Victoria was kind enough and generous enough to share some of the photographs that she had of her mother, and I actually show a blow-up of her mother's hands. I just can't imagine how painful it was. And I know some people might say, well, it's exploitive, but it really isn't, because Victoria wanted to show what she believes was possibly the cause of her mother's ailment and what caused her mother to suffer for so long. But the connection is that when Victoria gets regressed, the conversation she produces is half of her conversation with the people who took her, the aliens as it were, and things they say to her. And it's significant to note that Victoria was regressed 4 times by 3 leading world-class experts, Dr. Leo Sprinkle, Yvonne Smith, and Barbara Lamb. And consistently through those regressions, the transcripts, the actual electronic version of those transcripts, which Victoria had, I was able to listen to the audio, and consistently the people who took her, or the aliens who took her, say, you're such a good specimen. We can't understand why you're so healthy and your mother and your brother weren't. Well, the only thing that you can derive or ascertain from that by reading and listening to those regressions, those transcripts, is that they recognize that both her brother and her mother suffered as a result of exposure to the radiation in that plant. Now, it's National Lead of Ohio, and it was also Fernald, and it was one of the largest cleanups ever by the U.S. government. It turns out that there was deceit going on, and over 1 million pounds. Think about this: 1 million pounds of radioactive waste was put into the local environment as a result of that plant operating, obviously outside the controls under which it should have been operating. And Victoria's home was but a few miles away, and her mother actually worked in the plant while Victoria was in her mother. So her mother suffered this devastating disease, as it were, as a result of her exposure. And I believe that the aliens themselves were cognizant of this fact and just could not figure out how Victoria was still so healthy and could help them when her mother and brother were not.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I think that's one of the things that people are always, researchers are always trying to do, is to try and connect the dots with why they may be interested in certain subjects and not others. Is there anything else that kind of stood out to you in your research about why you think they may have been so interested and had repeatedly abducted her?
Well, if you think about it, let's say that somebody who's resistant to radiation, and if you were to enter that person in a breeding program, that genetically you might find a human that is resistant to radiation. And if your civilization lives in a high radiation place like outer space, then maybe cloning that person or using some of the genetics to help breed people in your own, in culture, it might be an advantage.
Sure, yeah, and that certainly would make sense. And in her early abduction accounts, now she talks about, I think she called them the ant people. And now, have you found in your research, because that was kind of, that was a new one for me, you've heard a lot about the Greys and some of the other, even reptilian type, beings. Hadn't heard this one. Is that fairly new to you, or have you read about other accounts of similar beings that she mentioned early on?
I'm sorry, you're going to have to repeat the question. Have I read other accounts that are similar to her?
Yeah, so the mention of the ant type people, I think she referred to them as early on in the book. Have you seen or read about other accounts of similar beings?
Well, I won't say specifically usage of the word ant, but much of what she says in her regressions I've read in books and the popular literature by reputable researchers. In fact, there are a couple of that actually blew me away when I was looking for verification. For example, she talks about insectoids dressed in Jesuit-type robes, with the hoods. And I actually found other citations by reputable researchers, particularly a couple who did regressions themselves, like Dr. David Jacobs. And in there are citations which talk about insectoids in Jesuit robes. And I thought, I'm never going to see this. And sure enough, I was able to see more than one corroboration of this. Now, when we talk about ants, it's interesting that I think the ants were more or less a screen memory that were implanted by your visitors. And the reason I say this is because in one of the regressions, she says, oh, it's the ant people, but they're bigger this time. And I think that might have just been something comfortable that was implanted in her brain that a child could cope with because it's ants. But later on, when she's an adult, she sees the same entities, but she remarks, oh, but they're much bigger. And so I think that at that point that, the screen memory is changing. I think they were the same entities as when she was a child, but now that she's able to handle it, they're revealing that, oh, hey, we're the same people you saw. And she says that in a regression, but they're bigger. So I just think it was more or less a screen memory.
The other thing that I found interesting about this case is that, there were some times when it seemed that she was in regression, that she was fearful of what was going on. But on the flip side of that, it seemed like there was also some calm to it, and that she almost kind of had felt a connection with these beings. So I think it's kind of an interesting dichotomy, but can you kind of speak to that? Because I thought that was interesting. I mean, obviously, a child who's getting abducted, there's going to be a pretty high fear factor. But there also seemed to be some interesting kind of connection with these beings that she had.
Well, she talks about them taking their eggs, for one thing. So that's clear evidence of a breeding program that she's involved in. The other is, and I'm still trying to piece this together, but she's very clear about them using a medical instrument that she describes as a small spatula. And it's so long, and at that point in the regression, she's not talking about them removing eggs, but she says, I think they put something inside of me. Or in another one, she says, I think they're removing something. I'm not sure what. And it's interesting, if you go and research medical tools that are used to remove a fetus during an abortion, that one of the tools that I found actually resembles very precisely the tool that she mentions. And so, although I think Victoria is not convinced about this, her testimony, a lot of which I did not put in the book because of certain constraints, is I think perhaps that she may have had a fetus implanted in her where she gestated it for a short time, and then it was eventually removed after 30, 60, 90 days. And I think that might have been what the instrument that she describes was used for, because my research shows that that's not the type of instrument that would be used to remove her eggs.
The other interesting thing is there seems to be a lot of cases similar to Victoria's here, where you talk about them, where they're doing some sort of hybridization between humans and aliens. This seems to be really well documented in abduction cases. I think you mentioned, and this was more, I want to say, in the latter part of the book, you talked about some of the work Dr. David Jacobs has done on the subject. I'm just kind of curious on your thoughts of what you think they may be trying to do with the hybridization program. Are they trying to actually bring hybrid beings onto the Earth and integrate with society, or what do you think from your research what's going on with this?
I've read a lot of theories, one of which is exactly what you mentioned, that they're updating us and they're creating maybe a more enlightened breed of human being, maybe a less warfare-prone type of human being, and that they're integrating us into society. And I've read places where, they're actually eating with regular human beings, and that's how they're going to pass on those hybrid genetics. I've read theories where they're trying to save their race, try to save, their genetics for whatever reason, and they're creating placeholders in these hybrids. They keep them aboard wherever they live, underwater, on spacecraft, and that's kind of a way of keeping those genetics alive to be passed on when they deem so necessary.
The other thing that I found interesting, so I think this was kind of early on in her abduction accounts, she talked about kind of passing through another kind of dimension, if you will, and I find that really, really fascinating, because there's a lot of talk about, where we think, whether they're extraterrestrials or interdimensional beings. I mean, does that introduce the possibility that there could be an intradimensional aspect to this versus, say, aliens from, a way off star system?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I ponder it daily. And having written 2 books about UFOs, I obviously have an open mind. But I was actually thinking about the interdimensional issue today, and I asked myself this question. I said, if they're interdimensional, do they really need spacecraft? And the answer is probably not. You know, if they're intergalactic, the answer is definitely yes. And I think there's been too many spacecraft spotted and reported. And you know, we can go back to 1947 and prior to that, and people reporting like, I don't know, Travis Walton, 5 days on a spaceship. You know, I don't get the drift, but those are interdimensional. I get the drift that they're intergalactic. So, are both possible? Certainly yes. But I think the majority of what we get is the intergalactic type, because they need spaceships to get here.
Yeah, and the other thing in her accounts now, there's a statement made in there which I also thought was pretty interesting, and I, you know, I don't know if this communication, because you get a lot of abductee accounts that they say that they think the communication is you know, they're actually communicating telepathically, if you will. And I almost got the sense that was the case with some of the beings she was experiencing. But there was a statement in there that one of them told her that you are us and we are you, something to that effect. Now, that may not be the exact quote, but you know, I'm kind of paraphrasing from the book. But what do you think is meant by that statement?
My first thought on that, when I read that transcript, well, I didn't read the transcript. I heard the audio, and I was creating the actual Word document transcript, that perhaps she is a hybrid, that her mother may have been part of the breeding program, so that, and maybe her grandmother or great-grandmother. So somewhere in there, it's possible that she's a, you know, first, second, third generation hybrid, and so that's what they're telling her, that you're not 100% human.
Right.
Pure speculation on my part.
Right, and then kind of the other thought that I had is it possible that if you believe in the reincarnation theory, that perhaps she could have, in another incarnation, been one of these beings? Is that something that you think could be possible as well?
You know what? I'm not going to discount any possibility.
Yeah, and with the, you know, going into some of these topics that I talk about on the show, there's some really weird cases where there's a lot of things going on, and I harken back to, I don't know if you've looked at the Skinwalker Ranch case, and some of I know Jeremy Corbell just came out with a film on that, where, you know, they had government researchers there, Robert Bigelow and his think tank, and there's a lot of weird stuff going on in unison. Well, I guess I shouldn't say in unison, but UFO sightings and other weird cryptid sightings and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know. I think it's good to kind of have an open mind to the possibilities here. And there seems to be a lot more talk about how all paranormal activity may be related in some way.
You know, a lot of this, it's difficult to keep up with. I actually had a couple minutes of fame with Jeremy a couple weeks ago. I talked at the UFO Mega Conference in Laughlin, Nevada. And it turns out that one night in the bar, and that's always happens, you know, it's an exhausting day, 10, 12 hours, and everyone wants to have a drink or a cola at the bar. And Jeremy was there, and Melinda Leslie was there, and Tana Newberry, and a few others, and we just kind of sat around talking, you know, about all the theories. And, you know, the conclusion that you always come to with such a diverse group like that is the topic is so broad, so high, so deep, that one person, literally, you just can't be an expert in it all, and you've got to choose something that maybe you have access to. Like for me, it's Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and that sort of thing. In this case, it was Victoria who agreed to tell her story to me. But, we just all agreed that there's so many facets to this. You can't be an expert in it all. And if you claim to be so, I would question your veracity.
Right. Yeah, it is such a deep and complex topic and phenomena. So you spent many years working as an engineer for the Air Force. I'm just kind of curious your take, because most of the UFO researchers think there's some sort of cover up going on here, and we can speculate about why and that sort of thing. But what do you think? One, do you still think that there is this truth embargo going on? And whoever's involved in it, very top level officials, whoever they may be, and do you think they have a valid justification for continuing the truth embargo?
Well, in light of the evidence, I would say it's a slam dunk case that there is what you term a truth embargo. There's too many witness statements, too many trace evidence cases, 30,000 plus. There's just too much for it to be a figment of everybody's imagination. So I think that issue is fairly well settled. Now, the question of why, a lot of things, I have some opinions, maybe I'll share them with you. I think the first thing is that let's just speculate we own a craft or crafts, and that for the last 70 years we've been reverse engineering technology off of this, and then we've been spinning it off in the commercial world. Now, Colonel Corso, who wrote The Day After Roswell, wrote a whole book about, I think with Dr. Burns, said, hey, I was in the right place, the right time. I was helping seed this stuff to industry, and we were spinning off this technology. So imagine that we're doing that. And imagine that our country is stronger because of it. Who invented the computer? Ta-da! Who runs the integrated circuits? Ta-da! Who introduced fiber optics? Ta-da! So this economy, I think, is fueled in a good part. The microchip changed all our lives and continues to do so today. Which country benefited a lot or the most? The good old US of A, and I love it. If we're still reverse engineering that kind of thing, and we're still staying economically viable, then there's absolutely no reason why we would want to share this with the rest of the world, especially if we're spinning off the benefits for everybody and the world at large is able to make the earth a better place. So I think just from a financial aspect, I think that we're wise to keep whatever it is we have and to continue the status quo. And I think that's a strong enough reason in itself to kind of not come out and go, yeah, we got this thing. I just think we're doing the right thing.
Right, and there's all this talk about disclosure and if it's going to happen or not, whether it be soft disclosure or just some level of disclosure. And I'm kind of the opinion that I may never see it in my lifetime. Again, that is just my opinion, and some of the reasons you've already mentioned, why the government would continue, or very, very small facets of the government. I worked in the intel community, and I know how stovepiped it is, and I know how little information is shared sometimes among channels. So there's, in my opinion, there may be only a few that have the bigger picture of what's going on here, who they are, and whatnot. I'm not really sure. But I would like to get your take on it. I always like to ask the different UFO researchers I have on the show, what's your take on it is? Do you think disclosure is going to happen anytime soon, or do you think it's going to happen at all?
I'm very skeptical that it's going to happen, and for at least one of the reasons that I just gave you. Do you see Russia, China, France, Britain, coming forth and saying, hey, we got a UFO and we need your engineers to help reverse engineer it, and, we're all going to benefit from this, make it a better world? That's not happening. So why would we, the U.S., go ahead, and if we had a craft, why would we admit it? There's no upside to that. In fact, the downside is if anyone were eventually to come out, how would they explain the 70-plus years of denial?
Right, absolutely, and there would be a lot of reckoning going back. Now, I've heard some researchers say you got to wipe the slate clean, and the only way it'll ever happen is you kind of forgive those transgressions that happened in the past. But yeah, I'm kind of I'm very, very cautiously optimistic. We had the 2017 Tic Tac video that came out to the Stars Academy. And it'd be interesting. I'm just wondering what your take is on that. Do you see that as kind of a positive development? And we really haven't seen anything come out of that recently, so I'm just curious what your take is.
You mean the Tic Tac UFO thing?
Yeah, the Tic Tac UFO video and the New York Times story that broke in December of 2017.
Let me address the previous aspect, then we'll get into Tic Tac. First of all, President Carter filed a UFO report and said, I want to know. He didn't find out. Reagan filed a UFO report, said, I want to know. He didn't. President Clinton went public and said, I want to know. And he told the world, I want to know. Nope, they didn't tell him. So if the president doesn't have need to know, do you think the general population has that famous phrase, need to know? The question is absolutely not. So I'll conclude the disclosure discussion with saying I'm not holding my breath, but I'll finish by saying I don't need it. I don't need the government to tell me what I know is true. And I suggest that everybody else, if you're interested enough in it, go to your library, some good books, find out who the good researchers are, read their stuff, go to a conference, convince yourself, and then, you make your own mind up. I don't need the government to tell me the sky is blue. Okay. So, end of that discussion. And then I filibustered. I'm sorry. What was the next question? The Tic Tac.
Yeah, the Tic Tac UFO video. And
I think the first media release were somewhat in error, and I'm going to forgive them because, facts run fast and furious, and they don't always have time to catch up to the facts as we painfully know. But they were always saying it was a government release. The fact of the matter is it was not a government release. It was a government project. But the guy who released it did not release it until he had left the government. And so technically and legally, it was not a government release.
Right.
So I think people need to understand and stop saying the government put this out. They did not. It was a person who was no longer affiliated with the government.
Right, and I think Luis Elizondo worked through the Freedom of Information Act process to get that video released. Now, the other thing I kind of wanted to get back to the book and Victoria's accounts. Now, another thing that you mentioned in the book is that one of the things that the reasons why you think her case is so solid is that she really was consistent in her regressions throughout. Can you talk a little bit more about that, about her regressions and the consistency in her accounts?
Absolutely. You look at if there was a Hall of Fame for hypnotherapists, hypno-regressionists, they are licensed, they're school licensed, and they take on different names, and I apologize if I don't have the exact legal name for them. What they do is they put their clients into a light trance that allows them to get around these subconscious blocks that either the client themselves have instituted or that the abductors have instituted to help block the memories of the individuals that have had an experience. Now, I've done my research, and what I've been able to find is that a hypnotically enhanced memory, the testimony that comes forward from a hypnotically enhanced memory, is legally admissible in a court of law. So somebody says, I had an accident and I can't remember who cut me off. So they put them under hypnosis. They do a regression, and in that regression, the guy goes, "Oh, I can see the license plate number. You know, it was HGJ 555 Zeta." And sure enough, find out that there's damage to this car. Okay, that testimony is legally admissible. So, you know, do the abductors leave a calling card? Sometimes they do. And they leave it in scoop marks, for example, or unexplained scars, or unexplained lost pregnancies, that type of thing. But the thing that I wanted to focus on is the fact that Victoria had 4 regressions by 3 of the world's leading hypnotherapists, Dr. Leo Sprinkle, Yvonne Smith, and Barbara Lamb. And each of these have had thousands. And so, given the legal aspects and given what I heard, and 3 were audio recordings, 1 was actually video with audio, I was able to make the transcripts, read them, and then cross-correlate them to look for similarities or look for places where the story might have varied widely. And then, if so, I can ask Victoria on all counts. I am 1,000% satisfied, not only with the transcripts that I've produced, large parts of which are in the book, but I have had the opportunity to speak personally with Barbara Lamb and Dr. Sprinkle at length about Victoria's case, because she gave me permission to discuss this with all of those individuals. And we talked about things like, can you fake it? Do you think she's faking it? Is it possible, you know, that she could have done this? They were 100% sure that what Victoria told them was what she knew to the best of her knowledge. And I grilled these people over and over again. In fact, I had hour-long discussions with Barbara Lamb at the UFO Mega Conference and have photographs to prove it. So the fact is that what she spoke to them and what she accurately repeated in great part, because some of it does change. You know, when she's under regression, they ask her for a specific event, and some of those events don't contain everything from a previous event, as you would expect. But I'm absolutely positively convinced if I had to go to court, I would win my case.
You know, you mentioned the scoop marks, and I think you mentioned in the book that maybe them taking skin samples, that sort of thing. Is there anything or any evidence or any reason to believe that some of this may have been implants, some sort of implants, anything of that nature?
That's highly possible.
Yeah, and the reason why I brought that up is that I know that there was another account you had in the book where she was driving and it seemed like there was a UFO. She saw a UFO that seemed to have been tracking her pretty closely, and you know, I know there's been theories about why people receive implants. Is it so that they can easily track them, kind of like when we tag animals and that sort of thing? So I'm just curious whether or not you think they may have been doing something to help kind of closely monitor her.
Again, that's entirely possible. There are folks out there like Steve Colburn, work with Dr. Roger Lear, and there's I think up to patient 18 or 19, these patients of Dr. where they removed implants and they discovered some anomalous properties. In one case, the implant was actually transmitting on a frequency that was used for secret communications in deep space at one time by the U.S. government. So it's interesting that, this little tiny speck, that I don't know how to describe it for your listeners, but maybe a quarter inch of a lead pencil, and it literally was transmitting, on this very, very unusual, formally classified frequency. How is that even possible?
Now, Raymond, are you still with me? You cut out.
I'm absolutely with you.
Okay. I apologize. It sounded like you cut out for just a minute there.
Conspiracy.
So the other thing that I wanted to talk about now, she had a couple of accounts where she was going to school in Boulder, and she had a friend. She was driving on a couple of occasions, I think at night, and it seems to be typical of a lot of these abduction cases. There's lost time. Can't remember kind of what happened after a certain point. Those two cases were really interesting in the book. I'm just wondering, did she have any idea how much lost time occurred on either of those cases after she went into regression?
What you're talking about is the fact that she was going to visit a friend who lived there on Sugarloaf Mountain, which is west of Denver by several miles, and she had been to this friend's house a number of times, so she knew the way very well. If you know Victoria, she doesn't get lost very easily. At least she's not admitted that to me. And on two occasions, she wound up not making it to her friend's house. And she had no idea how she got lost, how many times or how much time she had lost, where she wound up returning to that evening. And so if you read the book, you'll discover that I have about 60 hours or more of recorded conversations. She would refer to them as interrogations because I was really digging deep into everything, and we visited every topic a dozen times. And it kept nagging at me that she said, I can't remember what happened. So finally, I said, look, you're going to go to the Congress. Yvonne Smith is going to be there. Why don't you get a regression on those two events? Because I think you have missing time. I think you went aboard a spacecraft. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. And the point I'd like to make is that she's had so many episodes through all the years that I'm sure with enough time and enough regressions, I could pinpoint exactly what happened to her through the years. But and we may do that in the future. But right now, we just wanted to get her story out there with enough hardy evidence for the reader to convince themselves about what happened. And indeed, this case where she had this missing time and the friend would attest, yeah, never saw her that night, don't know what happened, we never talked about it, and, it just happened. And now we find out through the regression that she actually had been taken to a spacecraft.
Now, in these few accounts, I think she mentioned a couple of different beings. And again, going back to this mantis type, insectoid type being, and then the grays, which are so common in abduction cases. A lot of them, it seems to be, I'm no expert on the abduction phenomena by any means. I've read some things about it. It seems like in some of the cases it's been the grays, and then in other cases it's been there's been other types of beings, even a mention of reptilian type beings. But I just found it interesting that there was mention in the same abduction cases of these two beings. Is it something you think these are two different types of aliens possibly working together?
Well, she actually does mention ant people, and she mentions iridescent insectoids, and she mentions mantis in robes, and she mentions grays. So there seems to be a mishmash, and you gotta just wonder, like, would that be a screen memory? And you go, well, if it's a screen memory of a what did she say? A iridescent insectoid in a robe. You go, that's a pretty poor screen memory. So I'd have to take that one as kind of a literal description of what she actually saw. The same with the grays, where she says that there were smaller people that she thought were grays that were surrounding the table that she was laying on in at least one episode. So, you go to other testimonies, and it's not unusual to hear that there's a mix. For example, Travis Walton talks about these ugly creatures, insectoid type creatures, and then he finally broke free, punched one of them. If you read my book, Evidence, I actually talk about the time Travis told me about how he blew past these people and he knocked them down. I said, yes, this is where the term alien bowling came from. And then what happens is he winds up in another room, and now he's met with these Nordics, these beautiful people. And I speculate, and unfortunately, the idea and all the info didn't come to me till long after Travis and I had wrapped up our day together, that it possibly that, maybe the Nordic was a screen memory that was induced because he was panicked about these, what he called these grotesque creatures. And quite, so you got to wonder, are the Nordics really real? Or are they just a screen memory that is implanted because the grotesque creatures basically are hard to deal with?
Right, and that's an interesting theory there. The other thing that I wanted to ask you is, so in these regression cases, was there any discussion about, or did they communicate with her anything about where they're coming from, whether it's a star system or something else, anything about that she got messages on?
Do you know, I'm looking at an entire legal notepad, which I don't know, are they 3/4 of an inch thick? No, maybe half an inch thick. Wall-to-wall notes. And I'm thinking, I don't recall any part of any discussion where she said a place. They're Pleiadians or, who knows where. She, to the best of my knowledge, she never made a reference to location, not once.
Interesting. And the other thing, kind of going back to the agenda here, I had Preston Dennett on the show. He's a longtime UFO researcher, and he just put out a book about the healing powers of UFOs and all these cases where people have actually been healed. And then you contrast that, we talked about Dr. David Jacobs that thinks there's some sort of more nefarious agenda here, ultimately. And do you actually come out on one side or the other on this based on your research, or you just kind of still jury's kind of out on this? As far
what's the issue?
Yeah, just as far as what we think their agenda may be, their overall agenda is. Do they have some sort of nefarious agenda for us and Earth, or I think Dr. David Jacobs thinks that ultimately it's a control thing.
Yeah. Well, it's clear to me that there's a breeding program going on. What the purpose of it is, I don't think I'm smart enough to know that, and may never be smart enough to know that. But if you don't mind, I'd like to reverse the table on you and ask you a question.
Sure.
I was at the conference, and there was a lot of talk about MILABs, military abductions. And the speakers were saying, I'm absolutely positive I was taken to a military base. I saw the signs, that said, caution, whatever. I was taken to, a building that was military in looks. I was interrogated by people in military-looking uniforms. Now, you're a current or former member of the military, and I'm just wondering what your take is on that and what your theories are on that. And as a primer, do you think it's just possible that it's not really the military that are doing that? It's somebody, just kind of dressed in military garb using mothballed military establishments, maybe, fringe parts of a base, to make the people who have been, the contactees who have been quizzed about all their experiences, just to make them think it's the military. What's your thoughts on that?
Wow. Yeah, that's a heavy one. You know what? I really don't know. And, with all the access to information and everything I've had over the course of my career, nothing even comes close to anything related to that. I really don't know. Perhaps there is some sort of military involvement where they want to know what people have, whether there's evidence out there that there has been military interest or CIA interest in abductees and what they've experienced, and they've been questioned and that sort of thing. So I think there may be some interest in what people has experienced. Now, whether they've been whisked away to actual, no kidding, bases of ours to be interrogated, I don't know. I'm not sure I believe that. But I do believe there's interest, and they have some interest in understanding what's happened to abductees and trying to learn more about it. Which, interesting thing is maybe the government and you call it the deep state or whatever you want to call it, maybe they don't know as much about this phenomena as some people like to believe they do.
So do you think in your heart that a military person who swears a particular oath, do you think a military person would participate in the abduction of a U.S. citizen, or would it just be, hey, I'm just following orders?
Yeah, and that's a good question. I think it would be more of a, like I said, I think it'd be more of a, maybe they have questioned people and asked them because maybe they do know something about people being abducted, but whether they're actually, more nefarious intentions of military people being involved with this stuff, that's I guess for me, that's a little bit, that's kind of a bridge almost too far, but then again, I don't, I don't, anything's possible, I guess, when it comes to this. There's a lot of talk about, people in the government and things they've done and to try and hush people and that sort of stuff. I don't discount any of it. I just don't have any personal experience with it. And I'm not sure that that's actually really something that is going on. So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
No, I think you did. I think you're saying it's possible, but the military people I worked for 40 years, I can't possibly foresee them doing that unless it was like, listen, Sonny boy, this is your orders, and they're not going to get hurt. We just need you to go, pick them up at Chi-Chi's and bring them back here. But for me, I'm skeptical about the MILAB thing. I just think that it may be somebody, who has a perfect way to distract the abductee by dressing in faux military uniforms, and that it makes the trail harder to find the real culprits.
And a lot of information out there that, the military CIA has been involved in disinformation campaigns. I certainly think that's a good possibility as well. You've already pointed out some good reasons for the cover-up to continue. Going back to the disclosure issue, I really honestly don't know that we'll ever see it in an official way. The other thing I wanted to cover real quick, and I know our time's kind of short, is you've done some research into the enigma of the Men in Black. And there's been a lot of different theories, if you will, out there about who they may be. And I'm just wondering, based on your research, have you come to any kind of conclusion of who these people may be and what they're up to?
Well, the historical record shows that there are some guys that dress, kind of cliche, black suit, black tie, white shirt, nice black fedora, and one of their jobs is to obfuscate the truth. I know somebody who wrote a book about their UFO experiences, who had photographs. They were visited by Men in Black. One distracted him doing a, quote, interview. The other one actually was rummaging the house, and his photographs disappeared forever. There's also a famous case of Rex Harriman, who I think in the early 60s, mid-60s, was shot those famous photographs in Santa Ana, California. He loaned them out to, quote, men in black that told him they were from a local military base, and he'd already loaned these photographs out to the Force and some other organization. He got them back, and this time he loaned them out, and they disappeared for 28 years. And 28 years later, he gets a phone call, female voice that says, "Hey, have you looked in your mailbox?" He says, "No." They said, "Go out there and look." So he goes out, it's empty. Comes back in, half hour later, he gets another phone call. "Sorry about that. Check your mailbox again." He goes out there, and the Polaroids, 3 of the 4 Polaroids that were the originals, and he knew they were the originals because of markings he put on them, 28 years later, showed back up in his mailbox.
Wow.
And he claimed that they were government people that he would attribute to as possibly being this, many years later, men in black. So are they out there? I've seen guys that are in places dressed as men in black. It's made me highly suspicious. So do they exist? I think so. What they're up to, don't have a clue.
Interesting. Yeah, there's so many theories about who they can be, and I've heard people out there say they could even possibly be alien, and I find it a fascinating topic. I've just never really delved into it, and I suppose sometime I should try and get a guest on who's really researched the topic and kind of delve into it, because I think it is real.
What if they're not 100% alien? What if they're hybrid and they're trying to keep the alien agenda secret?
Right. Yeah. And there's so many possibilities, or just like you said, government agents that are there to kind of help keep the lid on things. And yeah, there's so many possibilities there. But an interesting, fascinating topic. Well, hey, Raymond, we're kind of getting short on time, and could you just, for the listeners, tell us where we can find your work? Do you have a website or anything they can visit to find your books?
I've actually purposely tried to keep minimal footprint. I'm happily retired. Spent 38 years and 9 months as a engineer scientist at Wright-Pat. I left there at a very high grade. So, my website is very humble, but if you go on Amazon and if you type in 3 words actually, 50 Shades UFO, 50 Shades UFO, you'll find my Amazon pages for my books. You'll find interviews I've done up there, radio shows. I was even in an episode of Ancient Aliens, aired the 1st of June last year. It's called Area 52. That's the name of the episode. And recently I was on Coast to Coast with George Knapp. That aired on the 17th of March. And I'm not sure if it's a subscription that you can listen to it, but a lot of my stuff is out there. So, have at it. And my email address is ITSAUFO. It's a UFO at yahoo.com. People want to send me an email. I try to get to as many as I can.
Yeah, that was a great interview, by the way, you did with George Knapp. I heard that one. Really enjoyed that. So for the listeners, if you want to go back to that, I think you said March 17th episode, check that one out. It was a great one. Any more books in the works right now? Is there a 3rd book in this series of the Shades of Grey series coming out?
Yeah, there's a final book. I'm taking a little break now. I wrote 2 books. The research started for the 2nd book several months after the one was issued. So there's a lot of radio shows and interviews, and flying out to do a show once in a while. So I'm taking the summer off, basically. I think the last book is going to be called 50 Shades of Grey's Nothing But the Truth. And it's going to be back to the nuts and bolts. I'm going to look at some people who found metal and had metal analyzed and that kind of thing. And, I'm getting so many stories. I can't investigate them all, but some of the good ones I'll definitely put in there. And I'd really like to finish with this thought for your listeners is, in no way, shape, or form am I, anti-government /UFO. It's a difficult problem. I don't think it's really solvable. And people ask me, well, did you have a great career? And I say yes. And if a magic fairy could come up to me and say, Ray, would you do it all over again? If they would tap me on the head and make me 22 years old and say, you're going to do your career all over again and work with those fabulous people who took care of you for nearly 4 decades, I would do it in a heartbeat. If you've ever had a chance to work with Air Force civilians in the research world, top-notch, well-educated, great people, and, I'd love to do it again. And if they got a spot for a paid investigator, they know where to find me.
Yeah. No, thank you for mentioning that, because, I'd kind of like to echo that. I spent many years in the Air Force as an officer and had a great career and worked with some wonderful people, probably some of the best people ever. So, I'm kind of with you on that. I have nothing really truthfully bad to say about the Air Force, except for the fact that there was some botching of the Air Force Project Blue Book, that went on for many years. But again, there were probably some reasons behind. I'm sure there were good reasons behind a lot of what they did, and I'm very thankful for the career I had and the time I spent in the military as well.
Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah, and hey, Raymond, it's been a pleasure to talk with you. I want to thank you so much for coming on and talking with me, and I'm going to be looking for that book down the road a ways. Really enjoyed reading this one, and maybe down the road a ways when the new book comes out, maybe we can talk again then.
And if you haven't read the first one, please do.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to doing that now. I will definitely get to that here soon. Got some other books I got to get to as well, but I'm looking forward to checking that one out as well.
Do you ski?
I do, but the knees are getting a little bad, so I don't do near as much as I used to, but certainly Utah's is one of the best places for it.
Oh, yeah, love it. That's why I asked. I'd love to get back there someday.
Yeah, it's some really great skiing. I've done skiing in Colorado and here, and I think Utah's got the best of it, but of course I'm a little biased.
Utah's the best of the best. There's no doubt in my mind. No offense to Colorado, but I just loved, that's the first place I went on a ski trip, and I think actually the snow is better, the people are friendlier, the prices were always better, there was much more variety. I didn't find the aloofness I found at places in Colorado. I'm not going to say any names, VAIL, but...
Yeah, all right. Well, hey, Raymond, once again, thank you so much for hanging out with me and talking with me. And again, the book is 50 Shades of Gray's Victoria's Secret Truth. That's the new book out, so you can get it on Amazon for the listeners. You want to check that out. It's a great book. So, Raymond, have a great night, and again, thanks for hanging out with me.
You're welcome. Talk to you again soon. Okay,
so that'll do it for tonight's show. Really hope you enjoyed that interview with Raymond. A very, very fascinating book and fascinating case that he's documented in his new book. I mistakenly mentioned on last episode that the next guest was going to be Dr. Diana Pasulka, and I apologize for that. Actually, Dr. Pasulka will be joining me on the next episode, and she is author of the book American Cosmic UFOs, Religion, and Technology. And so it's going to be amazing to have her on the show and talk about her latest book and her research on the UFO phenomena. If you know a friend that you think would like to tune into the show, please share a link with them. That can be one of the most powerful ways to get the word out is through word of mouth. And once again, thank you so much for tuning into the show, and really looking forward to next episode. Have a great night.